Another question one is frequently asked about one's life, and probably has to ask oneself, is, under what conditions would you lose or give it? I start with a slight bias against the question, which itself has some Hayes office and Heisenberg difficulties. Every November of my boyhood, we put on red poppies and attended highly patriotic services in remembrance of those who had given their lives. But on what assurance did we know that these gifts had really been made? Only the survivors, the living, could attest to it. In order to know that a person had truly laid down his life for his friends or comrades, one would have to hear it from his own lips, or at least have heard it promised in advance, and that presented another difficulty. Many brave and now dead soldiers had nonetheless been conscripts. The known martyrs, those who actually voluntarily sought death and rejoiced in the fact, had been the kamikaze pilots, immolating themselves to propitiate a divine emperor who looked, as Orwell once phrased it, like a monkey on a stick. Their Christian predecessors had endured torture and death, as well as inflicted it, in order to set up a theocracy. Their modern equivalents would be the suicide murderers, who mostly have the same aim in mind. About people who set out to lose their lives, then, there seems to hang an air of fanaticism, a gigantic sense of self-importance, unattractively fused with a masochistic tendency to self-abnegation. Not wholesome. The better and more realistic test would therefore seem to be, in what cause or on what principle would you risk your life? I reflect on the times when I nearly lost mine. One occasion in Northern Ireland I have already described. If I had had a moment to think then, as my life ebbed away, my last thought would have been that I was dying while feeling, and doubtless looking, a bloody fool. It also wouldn't even have been in a good cause, which is how many people, including my father, the commander, most desire to picture their deaths. In my case, it would have been journalistic ambition and youthful foolishness, and also, since I had blundered my way into an ambush, what the British soldiers of the time rather unfeelingly called an own goal. In Sarajevo in 1992, while being shown around the starved, bombarded city by the incomparable John Burns, I experienced 4 near misses in all, 3 of them in the course of one day. I certainly thought that the Bosnian cause was worth fighting for and worth defending, but I could not take myself seriously enough to imagine that my own demise would have forwarded the cause. I also discovered that famous jaunty Churchillism had its limits. The old war lover wrote in one of his more youthful reminiscences that there is nothing so exhilarating as being shot at without result. In my case, the experience of a whirring, whizzing horror just missing my ear was indeed briefly exciting, but on reflection made me want, above all, to get to the airport. Catching the plane out with a whole skin is the best part by far. Or suppose I had been hit by that mortar, that burst with an awful shriek so near to me, and turned into a Catherine wheel of body parts and, even worse, body ingredients. Once again I was moved above all, not by the thought that my death would count, but that it would not count in the least. I have sometimes discovered this sense of my own relative unimportance to be somewhat consoling. In Afghanistan a few years ago, I was stupid enough to get myself cut off and caught in the outwardly lovely western city of Herat, hard by the Persian border, in a goons' rodeo duel between 2 local homicidal potentates. The journalistic euphemism for this type is warlord, the image of the goons' rodeo I have annexed from Saul Bellow. On me was not enough money, not enough food, not enough documentation, not enough medication, not enough bottled water to withstand even a 2-day siege. I did not have a cell phone. Nobody in the world, I abruptly realized, knew where I was. I knew nobody in the town, and nobody in the town knew, perhaps a good thing, who I was either. And the local airport had been closed, so that the excrement-coloured capital city of Kabul, so far away, seemed suddenly like Parnassus. As all this started to register with me, the square began to fill with those least alluring of all types, strident but illiterate young men with religious headgear, high-velocity weapons, and modern jeeps. I had the chance for one phone call on a quavering line from the lobby of a terrible hotel. It went through, and an American Special Forces guy told me to wait just where I was. He told me later that when he first pulled up with his team and saw me standing in the mob with a shopping bag of books and papers and a nervous grin, he thought I had balls of brass. He soon lost that impression and came to appreciate what a danger and nuisance I was to myself and others. But we still see each other and correspond, and, heroic as he is, he once soberingly told me concerning the American presence in Afghanistan, "We're blondes out there, man. Dumb and innocent as the day is long." After a stay in the military post, where among other things I met an officer with the surname of Marks, who told me he was a Michael Moore fan, and where not one of the narcotics enforcement team believed in the starkly deranged war on drugs, I got myself onto an evacuation plane that was at least pointed at the capital city. Gazing out the window at the deforested and browned-over hills that had once been vineyards, and exhaling with relief at my deliverance, I began to feel a really shocking agony in my upper jaw. Had I been clenching my teeth with anxiety over the past few days? The question soon became immaterial, as I understood that something was really deeply wrong with at least one of my fangs and tusks. I could either do Afghan dentistry or take the long and penitential flight home to Washington. I remember almost every second of it, mainly because I don't cry all that easily, and by the time I was in DuPont Circle, I was white with misery. Of the later pain, I was forced to think, is this the sort of pang that women speak about with childbirth, where the memory simply and mercifully obliterates the recollection of what one's peeled nerves can inflict? In those days I had the same dentist as Vice President Dick Cheney, so was able to imagine my physician's deft fingers inside those massive shark-like jaws, so ready to slam shut on any sentence to do with torture. Finally weaned from analgesics and helpless puking, I was able to imagine, actually I obviously mean was quite unable to imagine, what my death would have been like if I had remained stranded in western Afghanistan and, like most people in the history of our primate species, been killed by my own teeth. On the most recent occasions when I faced either torture or death, the circumstances were either dubious or avoidable. My career as a writer was transfigured in 1992 when Graydon Carter succeeded Tina Brown as editor of Vanity Fair and asked me to become a regular columnist. In those days, the magazine was commonly and misleadingly referred to as glossy or even glitzy, and I privately suspected that there would be a trade-off for the many extra readers and extra dollars which I was being offered. Sooner or later would come pressure to write down a bit, or to simplify things for the customers, or to make certain concessions to over-literal fact-checking. On the contrary, every copy editor and researcher on the magazine does their unstinting best to encourage you to do the same. My bet with Graydon was essentially a simple one. In exchange for all this salary and all this freedom and all this exposure, he was to be able to ask me to write about or to undergo anything. A friend of mine, named John Ricketson Hatt, used to say that he would try anything once except incest and Scottish dancing. With Graydon, this has translated into my saying yes to undergoing a Brazilian bikini wax, and to writing an essay on why women weren't funny, as well as one on the origins of the term blowjob. It's led to much else besides, including volunteering to have myself waterboarded, very much more frightening, though less painful than the bikini wax, and to attending a series of rallies in Beirut in the spring of 2009. One of these was nasty enough, a huge Hezbollah event in the south of the city, where great phalanxes of segregated men and women gathered under a banner showing a triumphant nuclear mushroom cloud. And the other was positively inspiring in that it was a colossal, informal, unsegregated, unregimented, open-air gathering of Christians, Druze, Sunni Muslims and secularists, in coalition against the Syrian bullies and assassins and their Iranian proxies. I was exalted and exuberant enough, shortly after departing the latter, to make a mistake that still sometimes causes me to whistle and twitch and even to jerk awake. Walking along Hamra Street, the still fashionable boulevard of the city, I suddenly saw a swastika poster. This, I needed no telling, was the symbol of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. As a sort of insurance, the Assad regime in Damascus maintains not one but two totalitarian surrogate parties in Lebanon, the Shia-run Hezbollah and the SSNP, which has historically Greek Orthodox Christian roots. This two-track sectarian policy has no effect on those who are determined to define Baathism as secular. Turning to my friends Michael Totten and Jonathan Foreman, who were my company on the stroll, I made some biting comment or other and took out my pen to deface the offending display. Not unlike the young who tried to write fuck on a shutter and had got to F when a pious Hindu knocked him ass over tip in the gutter, I managed a four-letter word or so before being grabbed very hard from behind. A weaselly but wiry little tough guy kept hold of my jacket while speed-dialing for backup with his other hand. How true it is that on occasions of true fear, things seem to slow down and speed up. There were suddenly gaunt-looking creeps everywhere with wolfish expressions on their faces. I had, without knowing it, disfigured a poster that commemorated one of their martyrs. I suppose I could see that I had a kicking of some sort in my immediate future, and I am still wet with gratitude at the way that Michael and Jonathan stuck by me when they could easily have edged away. But what scared me the most was the way the first man wouldn't let go of me. I could see the trunk of the car opening up, and one of those private prison cellars that all Beiruti gangs so much enjoy maintaining. It was about 3 o'clock on a brilliantly sunny afternoon. I got a kicking and a smacking when the gang found its courage and suffered torn and bloody clothes and broken sunglasses, and was just very slightly mortified when Jonathan wrote later how awful it had been to see this happening to a 60-year-old man. But in the end there were enough bystanders around to make further horror difficult for the SSNP to bring off. They did terrify one cab driver into refusing us, but a second cabbie was bolder and we contrived to speed away. As we did so, one of the pro-Assad Nazis lunged through the window and caught me a poke high on my cheekbone, aiming for my eye. The pain and damage were negligible, but the look on his face is with me still. It was like meeting the enraptured gaze of one's torturer, or staring down the gun barrel of a twitching psychopath. I later learned that the last man in trouble on this block, a Sunni Arab journalist who'd only tried to photograph the swastika flags, was still in hospital after 3 months' intensive care. Attempting to salvage a rag of pride from my having fled the scene, I did my stuff as best I could. With a group of tough Druze members of the Socialist Party, I went back to the same corner an hour later to find it unpatrolled. And I kept my day to speak at the American University of Beirut, a night or so after that, even though the SSNP had by then produced a nasty poster with my name and face on it. The tough Druze Socialist Posse, you can be very sure, were invited along to that event also. But the plain fact is that I was rattled, and that I knew perfectly well that, had I really understood what I was doing on my little anti-swastika excursion, I would not have done it. I still make sure to go at least once every year to a country where things cannot be taken for granted and where there is either too much law and order or too little. Worst of all, I have found, are those post-Hobbesian places, such as the Congo, where tyranny and anarchy manage a fearful symmetry and occur simultaneously. One of the articles for Graydon Carter that won me the most praise was an essay titled Visit to a Small Planet, in which I described acquiring another identity and bribing my way into North Korea. Every time I got a tribute to the success of this piece, I felt a slight access of shame, because only I could appreciate what a failure it was. I had exerted all my slack literary muscles to evoke the eerie wretchedness and interstellar frigidity of the place, which is an absolutist despotism where the slaves are no longer even fed regularly, and is thus its own version of the worst of all possible worlds. But I knew with a sick certainty that I had absolutely not managed to convey to my readers anything of how it might feel to be a North Korean even for a day. Erich Fromm might perhaps have managed it, in a place with absolutely no private or personal life, with the incessant worship of a mediocre career sadist as the only culture, where all citizens are the permanent property of the state. The highest form of pointlessness has been achieved. When my friend Tom Dryberg had come home from the British Parliament's delegation to the opening up of the Nazi camps, he had felt himself inadequate to the task of describing them, at a dinner table which included Dylan Thomas. It occurs to me now that perhaps a dinner table wasn't the ideal setting to begin with. "They should send poets there," remarked Thomas. And one wishes that they had, or that some poets had gone of their own volition, if only to contest Theodor Adorno's later and highly dubious statement that after Auschwitz there could be no poetry. My own efforts have certainly schooled me in my shortcomings as a writer, as well as proved to me what I suspected, that I lacked the courage to be a real soldier or a real dissident. I have seen just enough warfare and political violence to know that, while I was pleased not to crack at first coming under fire, I could never be a full-time uniformed combatant or freedom fighter or even war correspondent. And I've been arrested and locked up frequently enough, for short enough periods of time, to know that my faculties of resistance in that crucial department are slight as well. On the sole occasion when I came close to being tortured by professional waterboarders who were nonetheless under my orders, I was so ashamed of how quickly I'd been broken that I asked them to do it again, and lasted perhaps a few seconds longer for the sake of appearances. A short footnote on the grape and the grain. In the continuing effort to gain some idea of how one appears to other people, nothing is more useful than exposing oneself to an audience of strangers in a bookstore or a lecture hall. Very often, for example, sitting anxiously in the front row are motherly-looking ladies who, when they later come to have their books inscribed, will say such reassuring things as, "It's so nice to meet you in person. I had the impression that you were so angry and maybe unhappy." I hadn't been at all aware of creating this effect. One of them, asking me to sign her copy of my Letters to a Young Contrarian, said to me wistfully, "I bought a copy of this to give to my son, hoping he'd become a contrarian, but he refused." Adorno would have appreciated the paradox. More affecting still is the anxious, considerate way that my hosts greet me, sometimes even at the airport, with a large bottle of Johnny Walker Black Label. It's almost as if they feel that they must propitiate the demon that I bring along with me. Interviewers arriving at my apartment frequently do the same, as if appeasing the insatiable. I don't want to say anything that will put even a small dent into this happy practice, but I do feel that I owe a few words. There was a time when I could reckon to outperform all but the most hardened imbibers, but now I drink relatively carefully. This ought to be obvious by induction. On average, I produce at least 1,000 words of printable copy every day, and sometimes more. I've never missed a deadline. I give a class or a lecture or a seminar perhaps 4 times a month, and have never been late for an engagement or shown up the worse for wear. My boyish visage and my mellifluous tones are fairly regularly to be seen and heard on TV and radio, and nothing will amplify the slightest slur more than the studio microphone. I think I did once appear on the BBC when fractionally whiffled, but those who asked me about it later were not sure whether I was not, a few days after September 11th, a bit angry as well as a bit tired. Anyway, it should be obvious that I couldn't do all of this if I was what the English so bluntly call a piss artist. It's the professional deformation of many writers, and has ruined not a few. I remember Kingsley Amis, himself no slouch, saying that he could tell on what page of the novel Paul Scott had reached for the bottle and thrown caution to the winds. I work at home, where there is indeed a bar-room, and can suit myself, but I don't. At about midday, a decent slug of Mr. Walker's Amber Restorative, cut with Perrier water, an ideal delivery system, and no ice. At luncheon, perhaps half a bottle of red wine, not always more, but never less. Then back to the desk, and ready to repeat the treatment at the evening meal. No after-dinner drinks, most especially nothing sweet, and never ever any brandy. Nightcaps depend on how well the day went, but always the mixture as before. No mixing. No messing around with a gin here and a vodka there. Alcohol makes other people less tedious, and food less bland, and can help provide what the Greeks call entheos, or the slight buzz of inspiration when reading or writing. The only worthwhile miracle in the New Testament, the transmutation of water into wine during the wedding at Cana, is a tribute to the persistence of Hellenism in an otherwise austere Judea. The same applies to the Seder at Passover, which is obviously modelled on the Platonic Symposium. Questions are asked, especially of the young, while wine is circulated. No better form of sodality has ever been devised. At Oxford, one was positively expected to take wine during tutorials. The tongue must be untied. It's not a coincidence that Omar Khayyam, rebuking and ridiculing the stone-faced Iranian mullahs of his time, pointed to the value of the grape as a mockery of their joyless and sterile regime. Visiting today's Iran, I was delighted to find that citizens made a point of defying the clerical ban on booze, keeping it in their homes for visitors, even if they didn't particularly take to it themselves, and bootlegging it with great brio and ingenuity. These small revolutions affirm the human. At the wild saturnalia that climaxes John Steinbeck's Tortilla Flat, the charismatic Danny manages to lay so many women that afterwards even the females who didn't receive his attentions prefer to claim, rather than appear to have been overlooked, that they were included too. I can't make any comparable boasts, but quite often I get second-hand reports about people who claim to have spent evenings in my company that belong to song, story, and legend when it comes to the Dionysian. I once paid a visit to the grotesque holding pen that the United States government maintains at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. There wasn't an unsupervised moment on the whole trip, and the main meal we ate, a heavily calorific affair that was supposed to demonstrate how well-nourished the detainees were, was made even more inedible by the way that water, with the option of a can of Sprite, flowed like wine. Yet a few days later I ran into a friend at the White House who told me half admiringly, "Way to go at Guantanamo. They say you managed to get your own bottle and open it down on the beach and have a party." This would have been utterly unfeasible in that bizarre Cuban enclave, half madrasa and half stockade, but it was still completely and willingly believed. Publicity means that actions are judged by reputations and not the other way about. I never wonder how it happens that mythical figures in religious history come to have fantastic rumours credited to their names. Hitch, making rules about drinking can be the sign of an alcoholic, as Martin Amis once teasingly said to me. Adorno would have savoured that as well. Of course, watching the clock for the start time is probably a bad sign, but here are some simple pieces of advice for the young. Don't drink on an empty stomach. The main point of the refreshment is the enhancement of food. Don't drink if you have the blues. It's a junk cure. Drink when you're in a good mood. Cheap booze is a false economy. It's not true that you shouldn't drink alone. These can be the happiest glasses you ever drain. Hangovers are another bad sign, and you should not expect to be believed if you take refuge in saying you can't properly remember last night. If you really don't remember, that's an even worse sign. Avoid all narcotics. These make you more boring rather than less, and are not designed, as are the grape and the grain, to enliven company. Be careful about upgrading too far to single malt Scotch. When you're voyaging in rough countries, it won't be easily available. Never even think about driving a car if you've taken a drop. It's much worse to see a woman drunk than a man. I don't know quite why this is true, but it just is. Don't ever be responsible for it. Thinking thrice about the Jewish question. The Jewish people and their fate are the living witness for the absence of redemption. This, one could say, is the meaning of the chosen people. The Jews are chosen to prove the absence of redemption. Leo Strauss, Why We Remain Jews. I think I may well be a Jew. Sylvia Plath, Daddy, 1962. In the early days of the December that my father was to die, my younger brother brought me the news that I was a Jew. I was then a transplanted Englishman in America, married, with one son, and, though unconsoled by any religion, a non-believing member of 2 Christian churches. On hearing the tidings, I was pleased to find that I was pleased. Immediately above is the opening paragraph of my essay for Ben Sonnenberg's quarterly Grand Street in the summer of 1988. It was reprinted quite a bit and gave the eponymous title to my first collection of essays, Prepared for the Worst. It was my first, and until now my only, excursion into memoir, was largely positive and even upbeat, if only because my semi-Semitism was on my mother's side rather than, as with Sylvia Plath, a distraught paternal bequest, and it closed with the easily uttered words, "To be continued." For the first 40-odd years of my life I had thought of myself as English, latterly with ambitions to become an Anglo-American. This national self-definition underwent an interesting change as a consequence of my maternal grandmother's outliving both of my parents. Yvonne took her own life at a distressingly young age. My father's robust health began to fail him in his late 70s, and he died in late 1987. My brother Peter, in the meantime, had become engaged to a Jewish girl and had taken her to meet Dodo, old Mrs. Dorothy Hickman, our only surviving grandparent. Later, and after she'd congratulated him on his choice, she rather disconcerted Peter by saying, "She's Jewish, isn't she?" He had agreed that this was the case, and then she disconcerted him even further by saying, "Well, I've got something to tell you. So are you." How had this taken so long to emerge, and why was it still to be counted as a family secret? My mother had not wanted anyone to know, and indeed my father had been all his life unaware of the fact, and was to remain so to the end. I have now been back through all the possible recollections, and am fairly sure that I can guess the reason. But here's the trail I followed. In what was once German Prussia, in the district of Posen, and very near the border of Poland, there was a town called Kempen, which had for much of its existence a Jewish majority. It is now called Kempno, and is about an hour's drive from the Polish city of Wrocław, formerly Breslau. A certain Mr. Nathaniel Blumenthal, born in Kempen in 1844, decided to leave, or was possibly taken by his parents, but at all events arrived in the English Midlands, and though he married out, became the father of 13 Orthodox children. It appears that he had disembarked at Liverpool. The joke among English Jews is that some of the duller emigrants did that, imagining that they had already reached New York, and settled in Leicester by 1871. On later census forms he gives his occupation as tailor. In 1893, one of old Nate's daughters married a certain Lionel Levin of Liverpool, the Levins also hailing originally from the Poznan area, and the British bureaucracy's marriage certificates certify them as having been wed according to the rites of the German and Polish Jews. My mother's mother, whose birth name was Dorothy Levin, was born 3 years later in 1896. It doesn't seem to have taken them long to decide on assimilation, in that by the time of the First World War the Blumenthal family name had become Dale, and the Levins were called Lynn. This might have had something to do with the general revulsion against German names at that epoch, when even the British royal family scrapped its Saxe-Coburg-Gotha titles and became the House of Windsor, conveniently metamorphosing other names like Battenberg into Mountbatten. But nominal assimilation didn't quite extend to the religious kind. Dodo could recall drawing the curtains on Friday night and bringing out the menorah, and also fasting on Yom Kippur, even if only for my figure, dear. But she also remembered being discreet about this, because in Oxford, where my great-grandparents had by then moved, there was a bit of low-level prejudice. My father had died very soon after Peter brought me the Jewish news, and I had flown over to England for the funeral, which Dodo was too frail to attend, and then gone at once to see her. What I wanted to understand was this: how had I been so incurious and so easily deceived? She seemed determined to act the part of a soap opera Jewish granny. I could always see it in you and your brother. You both had the Jewish brains. And she certainly and rather abruptly looked Jewish to me, which she hadn't while I was growing up, or perhaps better say, when I was a boy, I wasn't in any sense Jew-conscious. Dodo had dark and ringleted hair and a complexion to match, and when I registered this at all, it was with the stray thought that she looked like a gypsy. But when you're young, you take your relatives for granted, and even if you do ask childishly awkward questions, you tend to accept the answer. Hickman wasn't an especially exotic name. My mother used to laugh that she couldn't wait to get rid of it, and then wound up marrying a Hitchens. And when Peter and I asked what had happened to Dodo's husband, we were hushed with the information that he had died in the war. Since all family stories of all kinds were always about the war, we accepted this without question as being overwhelmingly probable. It was years later when Peter discovered that Dodo had been married to a drunken and adulterous wife-beater, Lionel Hickman by name, who had continued our Mischling tradition by converting to Judaism in order to marry her, given her an all-round vile time, and then been run over by a tram during the blackout that accompanied the Nazi blitzkrieg. Killed in the war, to be sure. As I sat with the old lady in her little suburban parlour in the South London suburbs, I kept asking myself if I had any memories that might amount to premonitions of, or other awarenesses of, this heritage. Once one starts looking for such things, I know, the chance of discovering them has a tendency to increase. There on the mantelpiece was a photograph of Yvonne, looking young and blonde and venturesome, and obviously quite well equipped to pass as a Gentile. "She didn't much want to be a Jew," said Dodo, "and I didn't think your father's family would have liked the idea either, so we just decided to keep it to ourselves." This was becoming dispiriting. My father had been a reactionary and a pessimist. The private eye caricatures of Dennis Thatcher had always reminded me of his insistently Eeyore-ish tone, sometimes taken up by my brother, but not at all a bigot. If anything about Yvonne's ethnic background might have given him check or pause, it would have been the discovery that her ancestors had identified themselves as German. The commander's view, echoing that of the Morgenthau Plan, was that post-1945 Germany would have been better if totally depopulated. But this he would not have thought of as a prejudice. I was suddenly visited by a long-ago memory of my father's father, breaking into a harangue when it became generally known in family circles that his elder grandson had declared for the Labour Party and for socialism. This must therefore have been about 1964, or perhaps, given the glacial pace at which news was delivered on his side of the family, as late as 1965 or even 66. He favoured me, I remember, in his rather grinding and harsh Portsmouth tones, with a sort of bestiary of sinister surnames, all tending to show the unsoundness of Labour's then parliamentary left. I can remember it now. Look at them. Sidney Silverman, John Mendelsohn, Tom Dryburgh, Ian Mikado, this last a Portsmouth lad into whom, along with the fat-headed future Labour Prime Minister James Callaghan, my schoolmaster grandpa had attempted to wallop the rudiments of an education. At the time I hadn't any idea what he meant to convey by all this, unless it was to identify, unpatriotically, German names. My later pal, Tom Dryburgh, had suffered cognomen persecution all his life without being in the least Jewish. But I was later able to guess by a sort of reverse engineering. I should say, in fairness, that my brother Peter firmly believes that the latter explanation, ordinary xenophobia rather than Jew hatred, in other words, is the likelier one. The old man was very forbidding in manner at the best of times. I can't imagine what it would have been like for my mother, let alone her mother, to be introduced to the patriarch in 1945, when her marriage to the commander was first mooted. One of the commander's very few surviving letters makes my point for me. It's to his brother Ray, and is dated 28 March 1945, from HMS Jamaica, which means that the warship must have been lying at anchor in the nearby Portsmouth harbour. Dear Ray, many thanks for your letter of felicitation. Yes, I quite agree that it does need a sense of proportion to enter the homestead and emerge unscathed, and I thought it as well to put Yvonne through this acid test before inquiring whether she was further interested. I don't think it would or could have taken Yvonne very long to decide against embarking upon some easy chat with her prospective father-in-law about the long line of milliners, tailors, kosher butchers, and, to be fair, dentists, from which I now know she had sprung. Looking back, I can't see my grandpa ever having had much use for any of the above professions. What he liked, or what I remember him liking, was lavishly illustrated histories of Protestant missionaries in Africa. On this topic she could have been of little comfort or joy to him. Sitting now with Dodo and recalling all this, I had to ask myself what Jewishness had meant to me, if anything, when I was a boy. I was completely sure that it meant nothing at all until I was 13, except as a sort of subtext to the Christian Bible stories with which I had been regaled at prep school. In some odd fashion, the Nazarene Jesus had been a sort of rabbi, and horribly executed under the mocking title of King of the Jews, but it had also been the Jews who most thirsted for his torture and death. Very, very occasionally some boy would make a mean or meaning or even demeaning remark about this, but in my early life there were no actual Jewish targets at which to direct such stuff. Moreover, the Nuremberg trials were a recent memory, and though most of our TV and movie fare still made it seem as if the Second World War had been a personal matter between Hitler and the better sort of English or British person, there were moments of documentary footage which showed the barely conceivable human detritus of the final solution, being bulldozed into mass graves. My mother, in my hearing, when I was very small, had once used the expression anti-Semitism, and I remember feeling with a sort of qualm that, without having it fully explained, I somehow knew what it meant. In Cambridge later on, there were Jewish boys at the school, and I suppose I noticed that they tended to have curlier hair and fleshier noses, rather as I had been led to expect. They also had names which were different. Perutz, the son of the Nobel Prize winner. Kissin, the clever boy who recommended that everyone read The New Statesman. Wertheimer, who wore a big lapel button saying that hanging is murder. They were among the few supporters of my failed Labour campaign of 1964, and I suppose that subliminally they confirmed my grandfather's view that there was something almost axiomatically subversive about Jewishness. In history classes I read about the Dreyfus case, and in English class wrote a defence of Shylock against his Venetian tormentors. There was mild occasional anti-Jewish vulgarity to be heard among some of the more dense boys, always a version of the same cliché about the Jews being oversharp in business, but one almost never heard or saw it directed at an actual Jew. In the summer of 1967, between my leaving my boarding school and going to Oxford, and while I was undergoing my long-distance postal mentorship with Peter Sedgwick, the various Arab republics and feudal monarchies made common cause, it seemed, in a war to extinguish the State of Israel. It seemed to me obvious that here was a tiny state, clinging to the seaboard of the eastern Mediterranean, and faced not with defeat but with existential obliteration. Like many leftists of the time, I sympathized by instinct with the Jewish state. I didn't do so completely without misgivings. I had heard so many foam-flecked Tories raving on about the hated Nasser ever since the Suez War of 1956 that I was on my guard at hearing the same rhetoric again, and I sent off in the mail for a pamphlet that was co-produced by the Israeli Socialist Organization and the Palestine Democratic Front, a screed which purported to offer a non-sectarian solution, but also proved to be written in a jargon that was based on no known language. Events, anyway, outpaced the pamphlet. Israel's paratroopers were soon at the Wailing Wall and at Sharm el-Sheikh, and all the braggadocio of Nasserist rhetoric was shown as both rather empty and rather hateful. In those days I still thought, as most people did, of the struggle between Israel and the Arabs, and not Israel and the Palestinians. "But just look how the press treats the Israelites," said Dodo with indignation, abolishing my reverie and recalling me to the unchanging present in this respect. "We've never been liked, you know. I suppose I shouldn't say it, but I think it's because they're jealous." By this stage in my life I knew slightly too much to accept this ancient self-pity as the explanation of everything, but I didn't want to have an argument with my sweet and sad old grandma, so I took my leave and, turning at her little garden gate, somewhat awkwardly uttered the salute, "Shalom." She responded, "Shalom, shalom," as easily as if we'd always greeted and parted this way, and, as I wrote it down at the time, I turned and trudged off to the station in the light, continuous English rain. That was also my birthright. Landscapes of Memory. "The deep, deep sleep of England," wrote Orwell half admiringly and half despairingly about the eternal and unchanging charm of the southern English countryside, as seen from the train between the English Channel and London itself. Being newly returned from the ever-freshening hells of the Spanish Civil War, he remembered enough to add rather severely that England might not jerk out of this slumber until it was abruptly roused by the roar and crash of bombs. Not far from the peaceful, rural Anglican churchyard in which he lies buried are the Cotswold villages of Upper and Lower Slaughter. Upper Slaughter is almost the only village in England that does not have a war memorial to commemorate the fallen of 1914 to 1918. These few hamlets are known in the war memorial literature as blessed, if you can imagine such a designation. What does that make the dead of the other hamlets? Even though I grew up in South Coast naval towns, where whole sleeves of streetscape had been stripped to show the scars of Nazi bombardment, I never failed to be struck by how swiftly one could slip from the city into the woods or along the back roads and onto the downs, and be transported into a landscape that was almost contemplative in its quietude. All right, even the word transported does have its nasty modern ring of deportation. Indeed, the early martyrs of the British labour movement were peasants from the Dorset village so bewitchingly named Tolpuddle, who were transported to Australia for the offence of forming a union. The offbeat names of the Hampshire and Sussex villages, Warblington was one of my favourites, with its flinted Saxon church, but East and indeed West Wittering ran it pretty close, seemed to convey a near Woodhouseian and Blandings-like beatitude and serenity. There were two especially favourite places within an easy drive. One of them the renowned Selborne, where Gilbert White had observed the ecology of just one little place in order to produce a micro-masterpiece of natural history, and then Chawton, near Alton. Some readers may already have caught their breath, I hope enviously. It was as easy as breathing to go and have tea near the place where Jane Austen had so wittily scribbled and so painfully died. One of the things that causes some critics to marvel at Miss Austen is the laconic way in which, as a daughter of the epoch that saw the Napoleonic Wars, she contrives like a Greek dramatist to keep it off the stage while she concentrates on the human factor. I think this comes close to affectation on the part of some of her admirers. Captain Frederick Wentworth in Persuasion, for example, is partly of interest to the female sex because of the prize loot he has extracted from his encounters with Bonaparte's navy. Still, as one born after Hiroshima, I can testify that a small Hampshire township, however large the number of names of the fallen on its village green war memorial, is more than a world away from any unpleasantness on the European mainland or the high or narrow seas that lie between. I used to love the detail that Hampshire's New Forest is so called because it was only planted for the hunt in the late 11th century. I remember watching with my father and brother through the fence of Stanstead House, the Sussex mansion of the Earl of Bessborough, one evening in the early 1960s, and seeing an immense golden meadow carpeted entirely by grazing rabbits. I'll never keep that quiet, or be that still, again. This was around the time of countrywide protest against the introduction of a horrible laboratory-confected disease named myxomatosis into the warrens of Old England to keep down the number of nibbling rodents. Richard Adams's lapine masterpiece, Watership Down, is the remarkable work that it is, not merely because it evokes the world of hedgerows and chalk downs and streams and spinneys, better than anything since The Wind in the Willows, but because it is only really possible to imagine gassing and massacre and organized cruelty on this ancient and green and gently rounded landscape if it is organized and carried out against herbivores. In the German tongue, in the Polish town, scraped flat by the roller of wars, wars, wars. Sylvia Plath, Daddy. If this is Upper Silesia, observed P.G. Woodhouse, after being interned in Poland by the Nazis in 1940, what on earth must Lower Silesia be like? He was being flippant, but with the excuse that he could have had no idea of what was about to make this region famous. When it came time for me to make my roots visit in search of my mother's Polish and German ancestors, it was actually for the lower-lying latitudes of Silesia that I set off. The city of Wrocław, which until 1945 had been called Breslau, was the big historic melting pot town that set the tone even for places across the Prussian border like Kempen or Kempner. When Dodo and others spoke of the place of their forebears, it was Breslau that they rather proudly or sadly named. And it was easy to see why. There was nothing provincial about it. In his book Microcosm, co-written with Roger Moorhouse, Norman Davies illustrates its eminence as a hub of Bohemian and Prussian life, as well as the epicenter of the Silesian question, itself the trigger of the 7 Years' War. Wars, wars, wars. Reading up on the region, I came across one moment when quintessential Englishness had in fact intersected with this darkling plain. In 1906, Winston Churchill, then the minister responsible for British colonies, had been honoured by an invitation from Kaiser Wilhelm II to attend the annual manoeuvres of the Imperial German Army held at Breslau. The Kaiser was resplendent in the uniform of the white Silesian cuirassier, and his massed and regimented infantry reminded one more of great Atlantic rollers than human formations. Clouds of cavalry, Avalanches of field guns and, at that time a novelty, squadrons of motor cars, private and military, completed the array. For 5 hours the immense defilade continued. Yet this was only a 20th of the armed strength of the regular German army before mobilization. Strange to find Winston Churchill and Sylvia Plath both choosing the word roller in both its juggernaut and wave-like declensions for that scene. I had a ghost or two at my elbow the entire time I was on what is now Polish soil. These revenants were of two kinds. The first, which was the nicest, had been gently summoned by my relatives, known and unknown. Every article and review and book that I've ever published has constituted an appeal to the personal persons to whom I should have talked before I dared to write it. I never launch any little essay without the hope and the fear, because the encounter may also be embarrassing, that I shall draw a letter that begins, "Dear Mr. Hitchens, it seems that you are unaware that." It is in this sense that authorship is collaborative with the reader, and there's no help for it. You only find out what you ought to have known by pretending to know at least some of it already. It doesn't matter how obscure or arcane or esoteric your place of publication may be. Some sweet law ensures that the person who should be scrutinizing your work eventually does do so. Thus I came into contact with a woman who was, or would have been if they'd known of each other, and thus was anyway, my mother's first cousin. She now lived on the coast of Norfolk. One of her Blumenthal Dale relatives had seen one of the reprints of my original article for Ben Sonnenberg, to which I had given the additional title, On Not Knowing the Half of It. Cast your bread on the waters. I'll condense the time that all this took, but simply say that by the time I arrived in Poland, I had a goodish oil-painting portrait of Nathan Blumenthal, a fair piece of his genealogy, and two chief questions remaining. Why had he left when he did? And were there any of his relations still around? Jane Austen died 2 years after the Battle of Waterloo, where the combined forces of the Duke of Wellington and, as some British historians remember to mention, the Prussians, under Marshal Blucher, put an end to the Napoleonic era. On the territories of the Prussian Silesian frontier, the echoes of this and later events are very far from being noises off. In particular was this true for the Jews of Kempno. In 1812, Napoleon had issued his emancipation decree, liberating the Jews from ancient church-mandated legal disabilities. In 1814-1815, the Kempen Jews had begun the construction of a rather magnificent synagogue in a sort of Neo-Palladian style. At the time they constituted perhaps 80% of the town. I found it unsettling yet confirming to think of this side of my mitochondrial DNA being replicated in this context. I've had my mother's wing of my genetic ancestry analyzed by the National Geographic Tracing Service, and there it all is, the arrow moving northward from the African savanna, skirting the Mediterranean by way of the Levant, and passing through Eastern and Central Europe before crossing to the British Isles, and all of this knowable by an analysis of the cells on the inside of my mouth. I almost prefer the more rambling and indirect and journalistic investigation, which seems somehow less deterministic. In Breslau-Rochwov, where I arrived on the day that Professor Leszek Kolakowski died, a national hero, and was honoured to be invited to speak at a meeting in his memory, I was lucky to be introduced to Mr. Jerzy Kiszler, the head of the local Jewish community and a veteran of the Polish Jewish diaspora. He also helps curate the city's Jewish cemetery, around which he guided me. It's like a memorial to Atlantis or Lyonesse. These are the stone buoys that mark a drowned world. From this city came the parents of Edith Stein, later martyred as a convert to Catholicism and as a nun in Auschwitz. Max Born, the Nobel laureate in physics in 1954, and the man to whom Einstein wrote that celebrated 1926 letter about God's refusal to play dice with the universe, was born here, to a father who hailed from Kempen. Max's daughter Irene moved to Cambridge and married a leader of the Enigma Ultra disencryption team. Their daughter became famous under the name Olivia Newton-John. Bourne's conversion to Lutheranism did him no more good than Edith Stein's when the Nazis applied their own laws about who was a Jew. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, another son of this place, had a twin sister who married a converted Jew. He was hanged in Flossenburg concentration camp, his murder commemorated in one of W. H. Auden's weaker poems, on almost the last day of the war in April 1945. One must beware of the temptation to invest everything with significance in retrospect, yet it chills the soul a bit to learn that from this great city centre of humane science and medicine, which produced the good doctor Alois Alzheimer, as well as the physicist Max Born, Professor Fritz Haber moved his operations to Berlin in 1914 in order to place his chemistry skills at the service of a military government in search of weapons of mass destruction. He oversaw the German chlorine gas attack at Ypres, and after 1918 concerned himself with the development of Zyklon B, thus radically attenuating his own posterity. Mr. Kitchener was an excellent guide through all this, offering information when it was requested and leaving me alone when I seemed to need that. Together we made a point of visiting the tomb of Ernst Geiger, one of the originators of Reform Judaism, and of Ferdinand Lassalle, founder of the first German Social Democratic Party, who, in a private letter from Karl Marx to Friedrich Engels, had been rather regrettably described as a Jewish nigger. He had been born on the 13th of April, the birthday that I share with Thomas Jefferson, Seamus Heaney, Alan Clark, Eudora Welty, and Orlando Letelier. The dates and the territory could also be made to fit with my own historical obsessions. When Nathan Blumenthal was born in 1844, Marx was just beginning to publish his economic and philosophical manuscripts in the Rhineland to the west. And, by the time he first turned up in English paperwork in 1871, Rosa Luxemburg was being born in the Russian-Polish town of Zamość, far to the east. Between these 2 points lay a sort of burned-over district, charred and trampled and desecrated in every direction and in every fashion. Trotsky had referred to the Hitler-Stalin pact as the midnight of the century, and it was across this terrain that the midnight had fallen. Wrocław-Breslau lies along the river Oder and boasts more than 100 bridges. One of the best ways to see it is like Venice, from the various arms and shoulders, as the natives say, of the waterways. Between it and Kempen-Kempnoe are many rolling fields and green copses and forests, both coniferous and deciduous. But even the greenery can seem bleak at best or menacing at worst when one recalls what was done in the shadow of those trees. At least in Wrocław-Breslau, the old White Stork synagogue had been restored for a community of a few hundred, and the Jewish cemetery stones, where possible, repaired or relapidated. But in Kempen-Kempnoe there was only desolation. Trying to translate back to English landscape, one would need to be evoking Oliver Goldsmith or Thomas Gray or John Clare on the abandonment and emptiness. But even that would be relative, and as much to do with the loss of sheep as the loss of people. Old Mr. Kitchener and I could easily have missed, nearly did miss, the turn-off for the town. An obscure crossroads, some railway tracks intersecting, a large and illuminated McDonald's hamburger sign. This could have been a nondescript Nowheresville in mid-prairie America. The local nickname for the eastern or Yiddish part of Kempen-Kempnoe was, it turned out, Kamchatka, the most extreme part of Siberia. Nobody quite seemed to know how such an irretrievably bare title came to be conferred, but it seemed apt enough, and the place seemed bizarrely unpeopled. When I later looked at the photographs I had taken, there wasn't a soul to be seen. My late friend Amos Elon has written the best history of the German-Jewish relationship. It's called The Pity of It All. I was very stirred to find when I opened it that he had placed on his epigraph page the opening lines of James Fenton's poem, A German Requiem. It is not what they built, it is what they knocked down. It is not the houses, it is the spaces between the houses. It is not the streets that exist, it is the streets that no longer exist. The lines recurred to me as I heard the echo of my footsteps. The noble old synagogue had been profaned and turned into a stable by the Nazis and left open to the elements by the communists, at least after they had briefly employed it as a furniture facility. It had then been vandalized and perhaps accidentally set aflame by incurious and callous local youths. Only the well-crafted walls really stood, though a recent grant from the European Union had allowed a makeshift roof and some wooden scaffolding to hold up and enclose the shell until further notice. Adjacent were the remains of a mikveh bath for the ritual purification of women, and a kosher abattoir for the ritual slaughter of beasts. I had to feel that it was grotesque that these obscurantist relics were the only ones to have survived. In a corner of the yard lay a pile of smashed stones, on which appeared inscriptions in Hebrew and sometimes Yiddish. These were all that remained of the gravestones. There wasn't a Jew left in the town, and there hadn't been one, said Mr. Kishler, since 1945. As we paged through the surviving municipal records, it actually became fairly easy to see how a once flourishing community might have decided to start emigrating well before that, and at about the time that Nathan had. Subsequent to the Napoleonic edict abolishing anti-Jewish laws, the indigenous religious prejudices had reasserted themselves. Starting in 1833, there had been a series of Prussian measures, often associated with the name of a statesman named Wagner, increasing taxes for Jews and making them pay for the upkeep of Christian schools and institutions, as well as adding to their burden of military service. After the aspirations of 1848 had been crushed, it got worse yet. The leader of the ultra-right authoritarians in the Prussian state parliament became Professor Friedrich Julius Stahl. He'd been born Joel Golson, and it wasn't enough for him to have converted to that bastardization of primitive Judaism known as Christianity. No, like Stalin after him, he also wanted a surname of steel. Amos Elon takes up the story. In the largest German state, where 2/3 of the Jewish population lived, he enunciated the philosophical basis for continuing discrimination against his former co-religionists. He was not a great thinker, but an able propagandist, persuasively articulating the conservative demand for authority and the sacred union of church and throne. 1848 had been a year of revolution and liberation for much of Europe, but other people's ardent nationalism isn't always, as they say, good for the Jews. It seemed probable that the brighter members of the Blumenthal clan would have seen and felt the atmosphere thickening. In this period also, according to the records, there had been quite a severe epidemic of cholera. Outbreaks like that aren't always good for the Jews either. They sometimes even manage to get themselves blamed for the plague or for the poisoning of the wells. But had the family left anyone behind? It's a common enough name, so I wasn't sure how I would be able to distinguish between cadet and collateral branches, but the necessity for making such a discrimination was soon enough removed from me. The editor of the local newspaper, Mr. Miroslav Lapa, had produced an illustrated history of the Jews of Kępno, entitled in Polish Kępiński Żydzi. Its photographs showed some of the major splendors, including the imposing temple in its high old times, and the family groups gathered contentedly in front of thriving shops. There were few pictures of the later miseries, but there were some lists of names. Every Blumenthal I could find in the index had wound up on the transports to Auschwitz. So that was that. I once spoke to someone who had survived the genocide in Rwanda, and she said to me that there was now nobody left on the face of the earth, either friend or relative, who knew who she was. No one who remembered her girlhood and her early mischief and family law. No sibling or boon companion who could tease her about that first romance. No lover or pal with whom to reminisce. All her birthdays, exam results, illnesses, friendships, kinships, gone. She went on living, but with a tabula rasa as her diary and calendar and notebook. I think of this every time I hear of the callow ambition to make a new start or to be born again. Do those who talk this way truly wish for the slate to be wiped? Genocide means not just mass killing to the level of extermination, but mass obliteration to the verge of extinction. You wish to have one more reflection on what it is to be made the object of a clean sweep? Try Vladimir Nabokov's microcosmic miniature story, Signs and Symbols, which is about angst and misery in general, but also succeeds in placing it in what might be termed a starkly individual perspective. The album of the distraught family contains a faded study of Aunt Rosa, a fussy, angular, wild-eyed old lady who had lived in a tremulous world of bad news, bankruptcies, train accidents, cancerous growths, until the Germans put her to death, together with all the people she'd worried about. We live only a few conscious decades, and we fret ourselves enough for several lifetimes. The various eggs and zygotes and other ingredients necessary for the subsequent conception and generation of the non-Anglo-Saxon half of the present author thus continued migrating, rather like the lucky and clever rabbits who left for Watership Down in good time, before the nozzles of poison had been callously shoved into the inlets of the ecology. Lonely and uncertain and angst-burdened as my grandmother's and mother's lives were in some ways to be, they took place in refulgent sunshine compared to what they had missed, by their forebears having gotten the hell out of Kempno. I still wasn't completely done with my investigations of this enthrallingly upsetting region of the past. In the case of another relative, my ancestor-in-law David Chmielewski, a sort of great-uncle, the trail also went as far as Auschwitz, but just for once did not end there. Born in the town of Kolo in the Poznan district in 1912, this man had a crepuscular existence on the edge of my family's awareness. He had, it was said, been a leading anti-Nazi resistor. He owns a chapter to himself in the anthology They Fought Back, a book which combats the wretched image of European Jews as fatalistic and passive. He had smuggled photographs out of Auschwitz, the Annus Mundi, or Heart of Darkness, that showed the transmutation of human beings into refuse and garbage. The intention had been to arouse the world's conscience by initially showing these to the Vatican. This appeal did not work. He had been some kind of figure in the post-war Polish government, and then there were some whispers of a scandal involving art theft, before being expelled to France in 1968 after the infamous anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist purge of the Communist Party. I had been on his track in a small and amateur way for a decade. I had arrived in Paris to try and find him, only to learn that he had recently died. There was no forwarding address. I went to see Daniel Singer, the late disciple of Isaac Deutscher, who from his apartment near the Matignon was himself a single-cell headquarters for anything to do with the Polish-Jewish Marxist diaspora. He sent me to a man in downtown New York who lent me the only book in Yiddish that I possess, the memoirs of David Chmielewski, and also a very hastily typed English translation. The title of the volume is Resistance in the Auschwitz-Birkenau Death Camp, but the backstory was also of considerable interest, and the lack of a post-story was perhaps more absorbing still. Chmielewski had quite early in his life developed a hunger to leave the isolated village of Kolo, which means wheel, and had volunteered to become a young Zionist pioneer. Leaving from a Romanian port and landing in Palestine under the British mandate, he had worked on a very tough kibbutz and also on the waterfront in Tel Aviv. From his pages one could count off the swift evolutions of an interwar political consciousness. He observed that Arab workers were paid less and treated more rudely, and he began to run into free-thinking people, one young girl in particular, who gave him horizons much wider and more thrilling than the shtetl or the shul. You think it's a stretch to connect Professor Max Born to Olivia Newton-John? Chmielewski's was almost the same Poland to Palestine route that was followed by Simon Persky, later Shimon Peres, the president of Israel, whose first cousin is Betty Persky or Lauren Bacall. I have quite recently found Chmielewski's Polish Communist-era file, which states unambiguously that in the 1930s he had joined the Communist Party of Palestine. His own memoirs, written post-1968, make no mention of this and give the impression, without exactly making the claim, that he had really preferred the Jewish Socialist Bund. However that may be, he attended a militant Jewish workers' meeting one day in 1936 and volunteered to leave Palestine in order to fight the rising menace of Hitlerism in Spain. He became a member of the Polish battalion of the International Brigade that was named for the great national poet Adam Mickiewicz. He was wounded and was succoured in hospital by the better-off American emigrated branch of his family, the family of my wonderful late mother-in-law, which also sent a son to that war. I pause to mention that with my sister-in-law's Uncle Ernest Halperin, this makes three widely dispersed ancestral relations of mine who fought for the Spanish Republic, something to tell my own descendants, some of whom carry their blood, if they will only hold still and listen to my tales. This is also probably the largest difference between the two sides of my family. Apart from the traditional stories of British daring, the only example of heroism and gallantry ever related to me by the commander was that of the Francoist, General José Moscado, who refused to surrender the besieged Alcazar, even when the Red forces threatened to execute his son Luis. Escaping to France after the victory of Spanish fascism, Chmielewski soon found that Europe's pain had hardly begun. He was arrested by the German invaders of Paris and shipped back home to Auschwitz, where he was employed as a roofer in the actual building of the labour camp section of the place. People a few years older than me who did their national service in the British Army say that you never ever forget your number, the digits that become you for the duration. Chmielewski's number in Auschwitz, I have learned, was 27849, a relatively low one. He wore it for the rest of his life. Able to make contact in the newly drafted slave labour force with veterans of Spain and other hardened comrades, he had at least the chance of keeping up morale and of surviving. His memoir is strangely artless and appealing, at times almost naive. Here is his account of helping to organize a clandestine Yom Kippur service, at which the Kol Nidre prayer could be decently sung by the slaves and the condemned, in Auschwitz in the winter of 1943. To his own boyhood shtetl, he recalls, unable to form a minyan, Jews from surrounding villages and settlements would come with their families. Even if they had a minyan, the quorum of 10 male Jews that is needful for a service to be held, they would still have needed a cantor or a prayer leader with the proper amount of feeling. The melody of that particular prayer is dear to the heart of every Jew, even if he is not observant. I did not take the way along which my father would have led me. My life journey distanced me from religious tradition and moved me closer to those who fight for justice on this earth, like those who took up arms against fascism on the battlefields of Spain, in the French partisan groups, and also in the death camp known as Auschwitz-Birkenau. To me, the facilitation in the camps of any action forbidden by the Germans was part of the struggle against the Hitlerite enemy. Ever since then, when I pass a synagogue on Yom Kippur Eve, there comes before my eyes the picture of the barracks in Auschwitz, where a small number of worshippers was able to experience the atmosphere of the high holy days. These are noble, even exalted sentiments, which would provide some evidence for those who maintain that religion is at least a supplier of consolation. But they're also somehow boringly expressed. They have a tinge of the popular front to them with their facilitations and other rather wooden expressions. They don't possess the defiant excitement of Primo Levi, who once wrote so bitingly that if he was God, he would have wanted to spit on anyone who prayed in Auschwitz. In a way, Chmielewski survived precisely because he was a good party man. He lived to help arrange the post-war trials of the Auschwitz criminals, including one historic session that was organized by Germans and not by the Allies. He was able to testify and also to bring important photographic evidence. In 1960, he was garlanded with a high resistance decoration by Joseph Sienkiewicz, the socialist-turned-communist Prime Minister of Poland, who had been a fellow inmate of the same camp. And this is where my real problem with him begins to take on shape. I sit in Poland, reading again his bureaucratic prose, and find that he claims to have taken up a job within the national administration after 1945. What does it mean, this post within the national administration? It means, as I eventually discover from the Polish Ministry of Interior archives in the Hoover Institution at Stanford, that Chmielewski was a full colonel responsible for Department 7 of the Militia Obywatelska, or Citizens Militia, headquartered in an old Warsaw palace that had been a seat of secret police authority since Tsarist days. He never once alludes to this in his account of being forced out of Poland in 1967, preferring to blame historic anti-Jewish prejudice for the whole business. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, historians have become both more accurate and more honest, fractionally more brave, one might say, about that other cleansing of the regions and peoples that were ground to atoms between the upper and nether millstones of Hitlerism and Stalinism. One of the most objective chroniclers is Professor Timothy Snyder of Yale University. In his view, it is still Operation Reinhardt, or the planned destruction of Polish Jewry, that is to be considered as the centerpiece of what we commonly call the Holocaust, in which of the estimated 5.7 million Jewish dead, roughly 3 million, were pre-war Polish citizens. We should not at all allow ourselves to forget the millions of non-Jewish citizens of Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, and other Slav territories who were also massacred. But for me, the salient fact remains that anti-Semitism was the regnant, essential organizing principle of all the other National Socialist race theories. It's thus not to be thought of as just one prejudice among many. You can't visit the area, though, without noticing the marks of what became a second erasure. The city of Wrocław, Breslau, had been almost identically rebuilt by the communists, along the lines of its pre-war layout and architecture. And right down to its main square and grass market, it looked like a storybook German town. But in that case, where was everybody? And where had they gone? You can find one restored Jewish cemetery, but try finding another one where any of the tombstones are incised in German. I went to call on the mayor, a sturdy, thoughtful man named Raphael Dutkiewicz, who ruefully said that the problem with citizenship in his rather large bailiwick was that nobody is really from here. Again, I consult the rugged statistics offered by Professor Snyder. Almost 8 million German civilians were expelled or fled and returned and were then expelled from Poland at the end of the Second World War. The Eastern German lands from which they had fled or been pushed were then annexed by Poland. To make up the shortfall of population, Poles were moved into these Silesian provinces, and as if to encourage that process, the eastern half of pre-war Poland was in turn annexed by the big brother Soviet Union, and 1 million expelled Poles became settlers in the areas from which Germans had been evicted. A huge zone of silence and complicity was created by this double negation. There's no exact moral equivalence between these crimes against humanity. It's true that perhaps 600,000 Germans were killed in the whole business, which also involved the cleansing of Germans from the Czech lands. But many of these died in the fighting which the Nazis had so insanely prolonged. Breslau-Wrocław was declared a fortress or Festung city by the Third Reich, and actually surrendered after the fall of Berlin itself, by which time it had been so much reduced to shards that there was nothing left to fight over. So you could say, as some people defensively say about the levelling of such cities as Dresden and Würzburg, that the Nazis started it and the Germans were punished for it. What people still do not like to admit is that there were two crimes in the form of one. Just as the destruction of Jewry was the necessary condition for the rise and expansion of Nazism, so the ethnic cleansing of Germans was a precondition for the Stalinization of Poland. I first noticed this point when reading an essay by the late Ernest Gellner, who at the end of the war had warned Eastern Europeans that collective punishment of Germans would put them under Stalin's tutelage indefinitely. They would always feel the guilty need for an ally against potential German revenge. It is exactly the fear of revenge that motivates the deepest crimes, from the killing of the enemy's children, lest they grow up to play their own part, to the erasure of the enemy's graveyards and holy places, so that his hated name can be forgotten. And thus to my final and most melancholy point, a great number of Stalin's enforcers and henchmen in Eastern Europe were Jews, and not just a great number, but a great proportion. The proportion was especially high in the secret police and security departments, where no doubt revenge played its own part, as did the ideological attachment to communism that was so strong among internationally minded Jews at that period. Jews like David Chmielewski. There were reasonably strong indigenous communist forces in Czechoslovakia and East Germany, but in Hungary and Poland, the communists were a small minority and knew it, were dependent on the Red Army and aware of the fact, and were disproportionately Jewish and widely detested for that reason. My brave friend Anne Applebaum is about to confront this neglected aspect of the hidden history of the region in her study of the imposition of communism after 1945. Of course, it goes without saying that once Stalin had consolidated his power, he began to eliminate local rivals, many of whom, like Arthur London and Laszlo Reich, were also Jews. Interestingly, there was never such a show trial in Poland. Many of the penal labour camps constructed by the Nazis were later used as holding pens for German deportees by the communists, and some of those who ran these grim places were Jewish. Nobody from Israel or the diaspora who goes to the east of Europe on a family history fishing trip should be unaware of the chance that they will find out both much less and much more than the package tour had promised them. It's easy to say with Albert Camus, neither victims nor executioners, but real history is more pitiless even than you had been told it was. On the centennial of Isaiah Berlin in June 2009, David Aberbach wrote, "He could be as scathing as the Russian Hebrew writers in his denunciations of Jews and Israel, more precisely the Israeli government. He followed Mendeley when he compared Jews to hunchbacks, Jewish Slavery and Emancipation, 1951, though he also echoed Kafka's allegory of Jewish deformity, a report to an academy. Berlin believed that emancipation had turned the Jews into homeless, psychologically deformed strangers, trying to gain acceptance in the Gentile world.